In case you're here for the first time or joining us after a long time and you didn't know, then we are in a series in the book of Ecclesiastes. And as I go through the introduction, that's your time to find it in your Bible, right? Don't feel shy to look at the index. It is not a book that is very commonly studied amongst believers, but the book of Ecclesiastes. And this is the fourth week that we are in this book. The key word in the book of Ecclesiastes that is used over and over and over again is the word meaningless. Meaningless, meaningless. In fact, it's used twice. Meaningless, meaningless. And throughout the Bible, it keeps coming up. Throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, it keeps coming up. And it's ironic that a book whose central word is meaningless is actually a book that is pregnant with meaning for us this morning. It brings a lot of meaning to us. Now, if you read through Ecclesiastes without studying it, you just read through an overview of the book, without reading between the lines, without stopping to understand, just a casual read of the book, then if you have got a counselor's inclination or a counselor's heart, you would be tempted to find this guy and call him in for a few sessions because he looks like he needs counseling. In fact, if you got this kind of language in a WhatsApp message from a friend of yours, you'd drive across to make sure they don't do anything to themselves. Because he seems to have decided that there is no point to living anymore. There is no point to all of this. Everything he's done, and over the last few weeks you've looked at a few of these themes that he has rendered as meaningless. He's talked about wisdom and he said it's meaningless. He's talked about folly and he said it's meaningless. He's talked about pleasure, about joy, about music, about accomplishments, about all these different things, and he said it's all just meaningless at the end of it all. And today, we're going to look at one more thing that he's going to call meaningless. And that's something that maybe you don't need much argument to convince you that it is meaningless, or at least to feel meaningless while you're in the midst of it. And that is the theme of work. Now, for many of you, you already feel that way. Sure, we live in a world that says, if you do what you love, then you'll never work a day in your life. If you make your passion your vocation, then you'll never work for a day in your life. I made my passion my vocation, and I don't just love what I do, I'm doing what I love, and I can tell you it is work. It doesn't feel like a holiday, it is work. Many of you are doing something you love. You're not just loving what you do, you're doing what you love, but it is work. And when I talk work, I'm not talking, when I say labor and toil and work and all these words that go together over here in the Bible, I'm not talking about a 9-to-5 job at a workplace, but we work through life. Maybe it's at an office desk some of the time. Maybe it's at a school desk some of the time. Maybe it's at home with your family, with your children, with your husband, with your wife, with your parents and with your siblings. But in some form or fashion, we all labor, we all toil. We all work. And the preacher over here says it's meaningless. It's meaningless at the end of it all. And he's going to give you 3 motivations for working hard over the next few chapters. 3 motivating factors that you could possibly have to work hard, to be good at what you do, whatever it is. And he's going to look at all of those 3 and at the commentary about each of those 3 motivating factors, and the hard work that results is meaningless. Meaningless. And there's 2 common reasons why all of those 3 motivating factors are rendered meaningless. So let's look at those 3 motivating factors. The first, in chapter 2 and verse 18. By now, see, I gave you a long introduction so you could find the book. It takes a while. Because Proverbs is a long book, and then Songs of Solomon, you felt shy when you opened it. So, you found Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 18. I hated all my toil, all my work, which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. This also is meaningless. The first reason you could work hard is for the word legacy. One of the reasons why people work hard, one motivating factor, is to build a legacy, to build something that you can give to the world, to build something big, a legacy of yours. And Solomon says the problem with that is after working so hard, after building it up, You have to give it away. And you can't guarantee who it goes to. It could be a wise person, it could be a fool. You can't decide that. It just goes away. And you don't know what they're going to do with this. You might spend a long time, your whole life working hard at something, and then it just falls into the hand of a fool. The next chairman of the board might retract all your decisions and take the company or whatever you worked at into a different direction. I think one of the best examples of this, a relevant current example of this, is Steve Jobs and the Apple company. You read his biography, brilliant biography. He shows you what a creative man he was, but more than that, what a hard-working man he was. He kept pushing himself. He kept pushing the boundaries of creativity. He never was satisfied with the accolades that the world gave him. Everyone was like, wow, amazing, the kind of stuff you came up with. And he's already thinking of how he can do something new, some new creative venture. And so while he was around, you had, the Apple products in their computers were just going better and better. You had the iPhone. When he was around, every year the iPhone would have a new version of itself, and you never knew what was coming. It was crazy, it was new. Each iPhone was different from the other in crazy and significant ways. And then he died. And I'll never forget that. Yeah, after he died, iPhone released, because they kept up with the tradition, they released the new version of the iPhone. And the big reveal was that it was bigger. That was it. And the number of jokes that went around all over the internet and social media about how Steve Jobs must be turning in his grave because all that he created was left to the hands of people who didn't really show much creative genius. They just made it bigger. That was it. And you find that for all his hard work, if he could come back for a second, he would say meaningless. What's the point of it? It's in the hands of people. Wise or fool, it fell into the hands of fools who are not creative, who are not pushing the boundaries of creativity. Because that was not just him, but that was the ethos that he thought he built into the company. But the moment he died, that ethos went with him. And the preacher over here in the Old Testament, King Solomon, would say, that's one problem with working for legacy. You don't know who it falls into. You can start your company, right? I could start Sandeep and Sons, and it might do really well, but then my son might not do much with it at the end of it. You have many fathers who have done well in their business and then given it to their child, and the child just let it fall away. And the preacher says, because of that gamble, because of that uncertainty, it's meaningless. What's the point of working? And he says in verse 20, so I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. I gave myself up to despair because after all I created, what's the point of it all? The second motivating factor that he gives you, and we're going to skip over chapter 3 because we're going to pick up chapter 3 next week. About a time for everything. But in chapter 4, you find another motivating factor that you could possibly have to work and to work hard. Chapter 4 and verse 4. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. Another reason you could have to work hard and to work at all is to keep up with the Joneses next door. Or to be more contextual, to keep up with the Kapoors next door. Right? Now it might not come out of greed. I'm not saying that it's a greedy nature. They have, so I also should have. It might be out of a good thing. He might, because of the way he lives, he might put the light bulb on in your mind about something that you can provide for your family. So might not necessarily be greed. But when you live based on how others are living, when you work and you work hard based on how others around you are living and what they're saying and doing, when that's the motivating factor, the preacher says it's meaningless. In India, I think when you bring in this others factor into it, one thing we need to talk about is that we live not just to be better than others, but to prove ourselves to others. Because very often in our Asian context, because it's a shame-based context, so when we are growing up, someone or the other has told us, you're never going to make it. you're not going to do anything in your life. Nothing good will ever come of you. Usually it's your Hindi teacher. Right? See, your first service, nobody got that. I felt alone. Consistently, it was my Hindi teacher. Nothing good is ever going to come of you. But sometimes it's not a teacher. Sometimes it's a sibling. Mom, dad, an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent who just kept saying, what? Nothing. Look, every other cousin. Everybody else is done. Whether it's a job or marriage, you're always compared to others. The reason I want a job, the reason I want to get married is not because I want it, but because otherwise they'll talk about me tomorrow. And we live for others. But when the motivating factor is how others are living, to prove ourselves to others or to be better than others, the preacher says, at the end of it all, when you come to the end of your life, meaningless. You will look back at all that you did and say, what was the point of it all? And the last motivating factor that he raises for us in chapter 5 and verse 10 is probably what a lot of us work for, and that is wealth. And he says in chapter 5 and verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. The great aviator, Howard Hughes, when he was asked, how much money is enough? Right? That's a question everybody asks. How much is enough? I think he gave the most brilliant answer and most honest answer anyone has ever given to that question. How much money, Howard, how much money is enough? And he said, just a little more. No matter where you are, the answer is always just a little more. We always want if I just had that little more, I would arrive at the life I need. And then you arrived. You had that little more and you've arrived at the life. And then next year we ask you the question and you'd say, little more I need. I'm still just struggling to make ends meet. Last year you were struggling. This year you got a raise. I know, but I'm still struggling. Just a little more. And what the preacher says is when you live a life for that just a little more, especially in wealth and riches, when you always are looking for a little more, you will reach the end of your life and you look back and say, meaningless. It was all meaningless. Because right at that deathbed, you will still be saying, just a little more. Of course, at that time it will be just a little more time. But you'll always live for just a little more, which means you're never satisfied with what you have right now. I don't know how many of you watch this TV show called Fresh Off the Boat. Okay, it's about an Asian family settled in the States. And the husband and wife, it's a Chinese family, and the wife is, this woman who pushes the family hard to do well, and the husband is a bit more chill. And there's this discussion between them where the husband says, why do you push us so hard? And she says, I push us hard so that we can have the good life. And they've got this mansion of a house they're living in. The kids are in a good school. Everything's going fine. The husband says, but we're already there. And she says, is this it? So then, I don't know what to do with myself because I'm only used to pushing hard to get the good life. And he says, we've got it. And she doesn't know what to do with herself because she always wants just a little more. You never stop pushing and you'll never be satisfied if just a little more is what you live for. 3 possible potential motivating factors to work and to work well, to work hard. And the preacher says all of them, not this preacher, but I echo the words of this preacher, King Solomon of Ecclesiastes, who says, it is all meaningless when you live that kind of an existence. It will all lead to meaningless, not just at the end of your life, but today, Sunday will finish, tomorrow morning, you will get up and be like, see, you get Monday morning blues. I don't. It's not because I'm godly, it's because Tuesday morning is work for me. Monday morning, I get blacks, my eyes are shut, I'm gone. You go to work. But Tuesday morning, I get Tuesday morning blues. That first day of the work week for all of us, when it begins, we'll go with an attitude that says, here we go again. And by Wednesday or Thursday, if you're going for any of these motivating factors, by Wednesday or Thursday at best, You will sit at your desk, whether it's a school desk, an office desk, or just the dining table at home, and you will think to yourself with your eyes shut, why do I do all this again? Why am I here? Why do I push so hard? And the preacher gives you fundamental reasons why these systems for work lead to meaninglessness. He gives you reasons, and the main reason for him, he gives two reasons, and the main two reasons for him, one is death, and the other is you at the center of it all. And in Jesus, we have the antidote to both of them. The first reason that all of these motivating factors, whatever they are anyways lead to a meaningless existence in a work life, is because whatever you do, whatever the motivating factor is, you're going to die. And that seems to be a theme throughout Ecclesiastes. Whatever you do, whoever you are, however great your life, however sorry your life is, at the end of the day, you die. You die. So you can build a great legacy, but you died and then it went to somebody else. You can live to keep up with the Kapoors, but then you died and you couldn't keep up with them. You lived and you were just waiting for that little more, and then you died without the little more. And his problem here is death. One of the main problems for the preacher is death, because death is that hurdle that he just couldn't jump over. And he worked hard under the sun for things under the sun. And death suddenly closed his eyes to everything under the sun and loosened his grip on everything under the sun. And he says, meaningless. But in Jesus, you have victory over death. In 1 Corinthians 15:55, Paul writing would say that, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O grave, is your sting? But in Christ, we have victory over death. Jesus has beaten death, and by His grace, He allows you and me through faith to partake in that victory over death. Death now no longer is that ultimate barrier for us. Jesus has not only given us victory over death, but has given us perspective beyond death. So that what you and I do now can be things that we take with us into heaven. Not the money, no. You're not going to take it with you. Not the legacy, no. But the way you work right now, and the way you can work for Jesus right now, can bring reward that lasts beyond death and even all through eternity. The preacher says meaningless because death got in the way. Paul says Jesus allows us to partake in His victory over death. But the second reason for all of this being relegated to meaninglessness is that it has you at the center of it. The legacy that you built, Steve Jobs' company, was successful with him at the center of it. The moment you took him out of the equation, it lost that spark. When you build a legacy, that structure that needs you for it to work, and God takes you out of the system, then that legacy starts to fall apart. The problem in all of these three motivating factors is it's got you at the center. Brother Rajan said this last week about the passage that he was studying about pleasure, where the preacher says, I did this, I did that, I accumulated, I built, I. It's all me. It had him at the center. And that was his fundamental flaw. That's why even in pleasure, meaninglessness was poured in large capacities. And in work as well, what the preacher says, looks at all this, is all me. All the structures, the motivating factors that build structures, has me at the center of it. I decide how much more I want. I decide which part of the Kapoor family I want to follow. I decide the legacy I want to leave. It's all me. And the antidote for that is the call of the New Testament, where the New Testament, Jesus calls you to die. There is no you. And that was the problem. The call of the New Testament is to die. Because if anyone ever knows how to live a purposeful, powerful, meaningful life, it is Christ. Nobody does it better than Him. And the call and the beauty of the New Testament is for you and me to die so that Christ can live His life through us. Paul answered that call, and he says in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. I don't live anymore. Christ lives through me. The difference in the preacher of Ecclesiastes and Paul is stark. The preacher of Ecclesiastes did not die and let God live through him. And so at the end of his life, he looks back and says, meaningless. But Paul, who died, who was crucified with Christ and let Christ live through him, Paul talks of his life when he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6 and 7. He says, I have run the race. I have fought the fight and I have kept the faith, and now what waits for me is a crown of righteousness. There is reward upon reward for me. When Paul talking about his life, uses language that just is pregnant with purpose and meaning. He says, my life counts for something. It wasn't meaningless at the end of it all. Why? Because my life is hidden in Christ. And the life I'm living is Christ's life through me. And so in the call of the New Testament in Jesus is the antidote to meaningless existence and meaningless work. But in the light of the danger of living a life where all your labor and toil and work can be rendered meaningless, and in the light of the beauty of the New Testament, where Jesus calls you for a life that has victory over death and a life that is full of meaning and purpose, what is a Christian's attitude to work? What should our attitude to work be? What should we think about work so that we can beat those Monday morning blues when they come? And very quickly, I've got 10 minutes left. Very quickly, 3 things that you and I can think correctly about work. The first is this. It's found in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, God created. Right there, at the start of it all, at the very first verse of your Bible, you find work. The very nature of the God you love and worship is that He is a God who is productive, who works. He is not a God who sits in a hammock, not doing a day's work in His life. No, God is a God who works. Right in the beginning, He created. The cross is the best example of God working hard for you. Paul, writing about it, would say how great a salvation He has worked out on your behalf. Paul, talking about what is Jesus doing today, he would say it is Him who wills and works within you for His purpose. Hebrews tells us that Jesus, once for all, after giving His sacrifice, giving His life as a sacrifice, sat down in heaven. But He didn't just sit down and say, that's it, I'm not going to work anymore. No, He intercedes for you. It's work. Have you seen your life? Have you seen my life? It needs intercession. And He picks up the work of interceding for us. And so the very nature and character of the God you worship, and the God that we worship and we love together, is that He is a God who works. And so you want a motivating factor to work, you are called to reflect Him. He is a God who works. See, very often we think work is a result of the fall. We think work is a result, if only Adam didn't sin. But work existed before the fall. Firstly in God. And then God has put into His system of creation work. Before He created Adam, work. Every beast of the field, every bird of the air, every fish of the sea works. Every seed that goes to the ground works. Nobody takes a seed, cracks it open, pulls the root out and stuffs water up it. The seed does it itself. It works. Nature is designed to reflect that attribute of God, of a God who works. Nature is designed and works that way. And man, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, it says God planted the garden. There He's working. Planted the garden, and He put man to work it, to tend for it and to work it. So if you thought Work was a result of the fall, and you've been blaming Adam for all your strife. It's not. Work is God's idea before the fall. But the second thing, attitude that you can have towards work, and you find that again in Genesis, is that work is not the meaning of your life. Tim Keller says it brilliantly in his book, Every Good Endeavor, and you do well to read that book because it talks about a Christian attitude towards work. But Tim Keller says it this way. He says, for any meaningful life, work is essential. But work is not the meaning of life. You want to live a meaningful life, you're going to work. But work is not the meaning of your life. And you find in Genesis chapter 3, where God comes to confront Adam and Eve after they have sinned, and He's pronouncing His judgment over them. He looks at Adam and He says, "Cursed be the ground beneath you. In pain and sweat will you work on it, and it will yield for you thorns and thistles." Now, if you look at it closely, and you look at the world you live in today, it's not really true, because people don't get thorns and thistles for their hard labor. In fact, they get quite good fruit, literal fruit and monetary fruit. People work and they get good fruit. They get good reward, good recompense for what they work, as hard as they work. So did God lie? No, that's not what God is saying. Because right after that, you have the story of Cain and Abel, where Abel brings an amazing sacrifice before God, a vegetarian sacrifice before God. Both Cain and Abel bring. Now, they didn't get thorns and thistles from the ground. They got fruit. But what God is telling Adam is this: you will work hard, and it will be hard to work on all of this, but it will leave you dissatisfied. And I submit to you this morning that in the punishment of God is also the blessing of God to Adam. Because if Adam found fulfillment and meaning and purpose in his work, then Adam would have been a workaholic, which is the plight of many people today. We have to work, because the moment we don't, we feel meaningless. Our existence becomes meaningless. Our whole identity and worth and meaning is wrapped up in that business card. If we didn't have that business card, I don't know who I am anymore. But God has designed humanity to not find its meaning and worth in what we do, but in who we are. We are in the image of God. And God punishes Adam that day. But within the punishment is wrapped up a blessing where God says, you will work, but you will never be satisfied in your work. Because if you do, you miss out on me, the Creator God. Your satisfaction is in me, Adam. You will look for it in your work. That's the punishment. But the blessing is that you will never find it in your work. And the lesson, the attitude that you and I can have as Christians towards work, one is that we reflect a God who works, but to never make work the meaning of our life. To never make our identity something that is based and rooted on our work that God has given us to do. Thirdly, all work that is productive in society is sacred work. Now, when I say all work that is productive in society, it's important to remember productive in society, because you have some very hard-working thieves. You have some very hard-working men and women who produce pornography. And that's hard work as well. But it is not sacred. But work that is productive to society is sacred, because that is God's system. God has created nature to work hard and to work in balance. When we work hard and work in balance, creation sustains itself. God sustains creation by just letting it be. Because if God decides nothing should exist, nothing would exist. But God has let everything exist, and He allows for creation in His system to work together in balance, productively so that creation sustains itself. Let me give you an example. You'll go home today, you will cook a meal for yourself. But for you to cook a meal, somebody had to be able to sell you vegetables. Somebody has to work to do that, for you to buy those vegetables. Somebody has to send gas to your house for you to cook. Somebody has to send electricity to your home. Somebody is working backstage. You can't see them, but they had to. For somebody to sell you the vegetable that you're about to cook, somebody had to grow the vegetable. For somebody to grow the vegetable had to grow. It had to do its work. And so within the system of God, everything works. And when everything works and produces, creation sustains itself. When one starts to work harder, when one starts to pull more and create imbalance, creation starts to groan. You see it around you. But God has created a system where when you work and you produce productively in society, all work becomes sacred. And I submit to you that in India, of all places, we need to hear that truth. Because in India, of all places, man, we demean some people's work. The way you will treat your CEO is so different from the way you will treat your maid. Because their worth is wrapped up in their work. But I submit to you, if your maid doesn't come for 3 months, you will realize the value of her work. You will realize how significant her work is. In fact, by the 2nd month, you might even realize she actually does more work than your CEO. But we don't see it as important, because we would never do that. But without some of these menial jobs, as we call them, society starts to fall apart. But when you realize that God has designed for different people to work in different ways, then you realize that all work is sacred and can be done unto God. One of the best examples of this is a 17th century monk, Brother Lawrence. And he wrote a book, Practicing the Presence of God. One of the must-reads for believers. Practicing the presence of God. And his job in the monastery for almost all of his life, especially during the whole time he wrote this book of his job in the monastery was peeling potatoes. That was it. In the kitchen. I tell you, if you had or I had that job, we'd have written a different book. We'd have written a book that says understanding God in the midst of disappointment. Experiencing God in pain. But Brother Lawrence wrote, Practicing the Presence of God. A beautiful devotional book that tells you you can be doing whatever you want and you can be doing it unto God. It echoes what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whether you eat or drink, in whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. What is a Christian attitude to work? How are you going to beat the Monday morning blues? To realize that work is not a curse, it is in the nature of God. To not let work become the meaning of your life, and then to view your work as sacred. To see how it betters the community and the society you're in. Ask God to show you that, so that you will realize the sanctity and the sacredness of your work, because it fits into His big ecosystem. My brother, my sister, when you realize the danger of meaningless existence in the workplace or through all your toil, when you realize the beauty of the call of the New Testament as the antidote to that meaningless existence, and when you understand the Christian worldview that is possible about work as well, then you will see your workplace as a mission field, and you will realize your work, how you work, why you work, is one of your greatest testimonies in that same mission field. And so I ask you today, What is your attitude towards work? Why are you working and pushing yourself hard? I'm not saying don't do it, but why would you do it? If you're doing it for any other reason other than unto God, then at the end of your entire life, you'll look back and it will be meaningless. But your work, whatever it is, in the home or in a workplace or in a classroom, when you work hard and you work as unto God, it plugs into an eternal story and derives an eternal weight of glory to it. Even peeling potatoes can yield one of the most powerful books and insights into God's presence. The workplace, the mission field, and work as a testimony. That is a great Christian mindset towards work. Because we often demonize the workplace and spiritualize church. And they're always at war with each other. But God doesn't do that. God calls you to the workplace you're in for a purpose. And that purpose is His own glory.